So in a slight disruption of that order, I'm going to start.
Oh, what did I say?
And I mean, in some ways, this will, I think, help with the framing because we have both a domestic and international focus on the panel, and I sort of represent, in some ways, a blend of the two because I work on Muslim communities, and Muslim communities are being affected domestically and internationally in obvious ways by the Trump administration. But what I would like to do, just to start, is to think about how to understand continuities and discontinuities, which is a different way of saying histories and what is it that's changing. When I joined the faculty here in 2009, I joined the Critical Race Studies faculty, and we were thinking already about how to conceive of the decade mark of the September 11th attacks. And as I came into that process and we began organizing around that decade point, what struck me was, again, the continuities between the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and we did an entire framing that looked precisely at that question. Then we did the 15-year mark, and we saw, yet again, more continuities, clearly, and the Obama administration, as it was concluding its 2 terms, had presided over a system that had shifted narratively the discursive frame through which they described Muslim communities, but as a matter of practice, largely entrenched the strategies that had been deployed in the war on terror, even as they eschewed some of that language. So what do we see now? Of course, what we see is 15 years of putting in place a machinery that enables a form of racialization domestically and internationally that has become deeply entrenched and that is ready just to take right off the shelf and build upon for this administration. So really we are talking about a system entirely of continuities. I just want to touch on a couple of notable features that we've seen already in these first 6 weeks and then turn to a broader set of questions that I think maybe even after we've heard from the first round of questions of the panelists, I might connect this to, I think, a global arc that's also been facilitated, again, by this broad war on terror framing that began with, didn't begin with September 11th, but was marked in September 11th and got much worse. There's a concern that I can't be seen. Would you like me to stand up?
Yes.
Okay. I did ask before I started whether I needed to stand, and was told I did not. So what are those markers of these first 6 weeks? Well, of course, the Muslim ban has been one element that has drawn a great deal of attention. Can you hear me? Okay. And that is absolutely continuous. I mean, to begin with, both a ban or attempt to severely restrict immigration from the Muslim majority world was introduced under the Bush administration, and different iterations of it have been seen at different moments over the last 15 years. But also a registry was created for Muslims coming in. A variety of different kinds of databases have been put in place that we've seen that target both immigrant communities and Muslim American communities. Most recently, for example, litigation around efforts by the New York Police Department to establish a massive intelligence database of secret files on Muslims, regardless of immigration status, was divulged in the course of litigation and has been stopped. But of course, the new administration and its new framing of policing in the U.S. means that the sets of interventions from the courts that have suspended those operations in New York, Los Angeles, and elsewhere are very likely to get overturned. Defining Islam generally and Muslims and adherents of Islam as a threat while simultaneously privileging presumptively white Judeo-Christian identity has been a covert, if you like, trope that has continued. Certainly, I mean, it predates September 11th. I could go back to 19th century and early 20th century immigration policies, but became part of an overt set of policies under the Bush administration, and then was sublimated in some ways, redescribed, countering violent extremism, thinking in broader category terms, avoiding the discursive framing that focused particularly on Muslims under the Obama administration. Now, that's an important move in some ways, right? It creates some space for people to resist the idea that Islam itself is the problem, that Muslims themselves have to be understood in this way as other and foreign. But really, with the practices continuing, the shift in the discursive frame is not sufficient to disrupt the actual processes, the formation, the structural racialization that Sharad spoke to in his opening comments. So when you see now all of these same tropes being rendered visible again, being brought back to the surface, being named and identified, it creates a different kind of opportunity potentially to disrupt, because now we no longer have to engage in the battle of how do we think about countering violent extremism. Is this in fact something that is essentially a formation designed to identify Muslims as threat? Is it a continuation? Those questions answer themselves today. But on the other hand, there is a new, obviously quite escalated set of fears that get triggered by the framings that this administration has brought in. And here there's a second element. So we've talked about Muslim ban, which had a set of domestic implications. Domestically and internationally, the embrace of a strategic advisor of the president of the view that this country and the West more broadly are involved in a civilizational clash with Islam generally resurrects not only tropes that date back to 19th and 20th century American immigration practices, but date back literally to the Middle Ages. I mean, now we're talking about drawing on a script that addresses Islam as a monolithic and unchanging other, which has no capacity to have values in common with other cultures, which is stagnant, not susceptible to influence or assimilation. Islam is an ideology that is barbaric, irrational, primitive, sexist, and simultaneously sexualized, and at base inferior to a West, again imagined and identified with Judeo-Christian cultural markers, and then marked again as a political or military formation, again Islam, an implacable opposition to the West, supportive of violence, aggression, terrorism. Now, you can see the continuities, right, from the Middle Ages through the Crusades to the present day, but you can also see why, again, this flows directly from a war on terror framing, a framing that we've been familiar with for 15 years at this point, a framing that has already told us that there's a way of understanding the Muslim majority world as an incubator of threat, and all individuals and communities that are tied in some way to Islam or to that world and are located here in the United States as an extension of that threat. So yes, there is something especially frightening about a chief advisor to the president that believes that war has a cleansing function and that identifies Islam as such, as the enemy in that war. But there is also something about that that simply makes visible the sets of basic framings that we've been living with for at least 15 years. And that terminological shift, again, enables an international formation of resistance, potentially, one that rejects the notion that we are broadly at war with Islam and forces others to interrogate how their practices resonate with, underwrite, reinforce, and connect to an American now defection from leadership, if you want, that is insisting on reframing international order in terms of direct conflict. The last of the areas where we've already seen incredible activity in the Trump administration has been around the deployment of counterterrorism framings to project coercive control. And this is, of course, not only domestically, but domestically they've repeatedly said that broad Muslim surveillance is now a national policy, that the very things that were repudiated in litigation, like the litigation we saw in New York against NYPD Muslim mapping projects, will be embraced as a broad framing for policing going forward. But we've also seen an endorsement of the coercive projection of control internationally, how counterterrorism connects to militarized frameworks everywhere from drone strikes to straightforward claims of intervention and pursuit of broadened arsenals and identification of Iran and other countries as potential targets of near-term military projects in the part of the United States. I don't need to remind an audience like this one of where we began shortly after September 11th in Afghanistan and Iraq, and how we have expanded our military projection into the Muslim majority world, and how that has also connected with the suppression of dissent here, with the treatment of Muslim Americans as connected, as internal enemies connected to that external other that we've projected our military power onto. So again, are there resonances here? Are there continuities here? I think there can be no doubt that that is the case, even as we're witnessing, without question, a level of escalation. So where does this leave us in thinking about racialized structures of power? I think what it does, and I hope this has become clear in these opening remarks, is that it brings to the surface and renders visible the project we as a country from the top have been engaged in through the framing of the war on terror as a racial project, as it has been shot through from the Bush administration to the present, with all of the themes that have been now surfaced explicitly by the Trump administration, and makes us able to see the coherence of that project domestically and internationally in a way that I hope will enable some also equally coherent strategies of resistance that are now able to name the thing they oppose in the explicit ways in which it's been made visible by this administration. Now, what does that mean? One thing I will turn to around the next set of remarks is understanding how that war on terror power framing has been a framing that has enabled and authorized authoritarianism around the world, and how that phenomenon, the concentration of executive power and the discretionary expansion of executive prerogatives, have now also come home to roost here. And what that means to understand our own government as just one dot in a large connected set of dots that represent a global arc towards authoritarianism. Thank you.